In order to keep learning in your field of expertise, you will need feedback of others. But how can you make sure that you get good and useful feedback? After all, you too will probably have been in situations in which you thought, this feedback is not very useful, or just confirmed things I already know. In this video, I will talk you through some practical steps for formulating an effective feedback question. Feedback questions that I often encounter in my own practice are in some way a variant of one of these. I'm stuck. What should I do? Is this good enough? Is this good? Tell me everything I need to improve. Or is it good enough now? These questions have two things in common. For one, they push all responsibility to the feedback giver. In fact, you say, just tell me what to do and I will follow you blindly. Two, the questions are information poor. They do not provide the feedback giver with any information on what you yourself have already thought of or done, considered. There are better options. Ask information-rich questions. In such questions, you first indicate what you've already tried or thought of, and on what part you specifically seek feedback. The feedback provider can then better accommodate their feedback to your situation, and hence give you adapted and useful feedback. Let's take a closer look on that first question. I'm stuck, what should I do? The information-rich alternative is a power question. You start with the P for problem. What is the problem that you run into? Or if it's not a real problem, what is the situation? Then you go on to describe the O for options. What options do you already see to solve the problem? What options can you think of? Or what options have you maybe even already given a try? The W stands for weighing. How do you weigh these options? What are the pros and cons of each of them? The E then stands for express preference. Given what you know and taking into account the weighing of the options, which one would you prefer at this point, without having received feedback? All of this is relevant information to share so that your feedback giver knows what you already know. The final R then stands for request feedback. Can you give me feedback on this? The feedback provider can then tap into, do I agree with the problem? Is there a problem in the first place? Are there any other options that you haven't thought of yourself? Are there any other pros and cons, or do you need to weigh them differently? In other words, with a power question, the feedback giver can actually give you powerful feedback. Let's turn to the second question. Is this good enough? First of all, my advice would be to ask this question in situations in which you in fact think that your work is good enough. You can ask a closer question. You start with a little bit of context of your work. How much energy or time did you already invest? And in what stadium do you think your work is? Some first rough ideas or close to the final version? Then you indicate on what learning objective you would like to get feedback. In doing so, you show that you know someone cannot comment on everything all in once, but that you want to focus their attention to a specific element of your work. The S and E together stand for self-evaluation. Include in your question why you think your work is good enough, or on what elements you have doubts or still feel a bit insecure about. That'll bring you to the R again, request feedback. Your feedback provider can then specifically address, taking into account your context, the learning objective that you indicated, and relate their feedback to your self-evaluation. This feedback question, a closer question, can help you identify how you can actually get closer to your goals. But often, you might not have a specific problem you run into, or there's no specific learning objective that you want feedback on. A power or closer question then won't work. Often we then see the question, just tell me everything I need to improve. But teachers or managers often just don't have the time to point out all possible points of improvement. And if they would, their feedback would be quite overwhelming. What you can do in such a situation in which you want to ask for feedback on things you don't see yet, you can ask a blind spot question. No acronym this time. So you can ask, I'm curious to hear what you think are the most important points of improvement in my current work. In other words, what are my biggest blind spots? That feedback then doesn't have to be exhaustive, but prioritizes the most important points of improvement for you at this moment. Then the last question. You've received feedback, used it, and now want to know, is it good now? The information-rich alternative to this one is a super question. You start with a summary of the earlier feedback. It is tempting to assume that the other person will remember exactly what feedback they gave you. But sometimes quite some time has passed since, or that person has given feedback to a lot of people in a short period of time. Also, we know from research that often feedback is perceived differently from how it was intended. The U stands for the use of feedback. You explain how you used the feedback and also what feedback you did not use. Maybe after careful consideration, you decided not to use certain elements of the feedback. With such an explanation, you show that you don't just blindly follow the feedback, but have critically analyzed it. Then you indicate in your product or performance what changes you made. In a written text, you can mark specific paragraphs, or when it's a performance, you can tell what you did differently this time compared to earlier situations. The next one is optional. You can consider to address the emotional impact of the feedback. After all, we all know that receiving feedback can trigger emotions. But please note, you don't need to address this in every feedback situation. It very much depends on whether you feel safe with a certain feedback giver. You then again end on the R for request for feedback. Did my work indeed become better as a result of my feedback use? Hopefully, these 4 questions will help you to collect useful feedback. Not with an attitude of, just tell me what to do, but this is what I already know and have considered, and these are the elements that I could use your feedback on to keep growing as a professional.